and talks about the controversy about how Japan is engaging in Chinese genocide, I guess, not really understanding the difference between Japan and China, and that's why this is the stupidity on stupidity political comedy clip to start the show with today and this is from the Fox News show Outnumbered, which is always filled with this kind of Fox News stupidity that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
There is outrage at the possibility the U.S. Olympic Committee could change Old Glory for its logo. A committee spokesperson is telling Fox News it's considering a redesign to replace the 50 stars and 5 new stars, or with 5 new stars and fewer stripes. Sean Hannity doesn't like it.
It's an awful idea because our Stars and Stripes should be the only flag representing this country at the Olympics and the Paralympics. So many amazing athletes and champions that we are all so proud of. And they represent the United States of America. We don't need your new flag. We already have our own.
I want to do a quick lightning round before we go deep on this. Morgan, just top thoughts.
I think we should leave the flag alone. When you look at Hong Kong, Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, right now, what are the protesters carrying? The American flag. It stands for freedom.
David.
If George Washington is going to get canceled by the left, certainly Betsy Ross isn't going to be excluded from that. And for those who don't know, Betsy Ross is the one who sewed the American flag originally. Harris, you know this, having covered the Middle East uprisings, Iran's uprisings. The American flag is the symbol for freedom. Freedom is universal, and it's why 80% of Americans are proud to be Americans.
Emily.
So in 2010, the USOC, their logo had only 13 stars and has for quite some time because they couldn't fit it on the logo. So there is a history of them having sort of amending this slightly, not out of disrespect, but trying to capture the essence. However, my bigger issue with this actually was the fact that they said we're seeking stakeholder input. And to me, that means that they only care what their sponsors say, even though to me, Team USA should represent every single American. And I think that the issue should be one of accuracy. The one should be in this climate where we are hearing apparently that the American flag is a symbol of hate and divisiveness. Why now then?
Yeah, I want to come back to a couple things. Kaley.
The U.S. Olympic Committee, they want a new brand, but our flag is not a brand. This is our country. This is our flag. Stand behind it. If you want to represent the United States of America on the world stage, our best athletes, don't get a new brand. Stand by our flag. Stand by our country.
Wow, I love that. I feel like we should just end the show now.
Just go to lunch. We're 10 minutes early.
I mean, the flag is not a brand. Our way of life is a beacon.
Yes.
People are trying to get here. All right, so now I'm going to go back. You know, Morgan, when you talk about it, it's so simplistic. Why do you think the U.S. Olympic Committee is making this so complicated for themselves?
You know, there's so much going on around these Olympics. I like to call them the genocide Olympics anyway. I'm still on the team that I'm not even sure that we should be competing because there is an ongoing genocide in Xinjiang. So if we are going to go to a country, if we are going to compete and have American athletes there in a country that's committing a genocide, even more important, Harris, to have the freedom of the American flag fully represented.
You know, David.
And there was like no factual correction there of Morgan Ortagus, who is a former Trump State Department spokesperson. That means her job with the Trump administration was to speak knowledgeably about foreign policy. I saw some of my live viewers saying that part of my live stream cut out there. I don't know exactly what happened. I might have to upload the recorded version of the program later if there's a big chunk missing, but I apologize for that. But anyway, like I said, that was the political comedy stupidity layered upon stupidity there, where not only was Fox News making a controversy about this flag logo that is no different from the modified flag that was used in the campaigns of the last 2 Republican presidential candidates, both Bush and Trump. As Brian Tashman pointed out in that tweet, and I put a link in the video description to Brian Tashman's tweet showing the first level of stupidity, but then of course there's Morgan Ortagus thinking that Japan is responsible for the Chinese genocide against the Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang province there, which is in China. Now, of course, if you go back to World War II, there is like Japanese history of genocidal behavior in China during World War II. There, I mean, lots of war crimes, at least, if it doesn't rise to the level of genocide. But you can let me know what you think down in the comment section about the stupidity layered on stupidity from Fox News in that last clip. And now, like I said earlier, which I hope my live viewers got to see, after the political comedy clip, I have 4 clips on the news summaries, which are on the COVID resurgence amongst the unvaccinated, that got the same amount of votes as my title topic, continuing fight for voting rights. Of course, I said the COVID resurgence among unvaccinated would be pandemic among the unvaccinated would be the, I would call the topic of all these next 4 news summaries I'm going to show you. And then the continuing fight for voting rights, that's existential threat to U.S. democracy, which I'll discuss with the last 4 clips. Before I get to my bonus Dash and Sandy or Dandy clips, I actually have 2 of them to show you at the end for the Dash and Sandy fans out there. And by the way, Sandy is doing better with her old dog vestibular disease, or vestibulitis, or whatever you want to call it. And I'll talk about that at the end of the show if that interests you. But I want to get to these 4 news summaries talking about how the U.S. is experiencing possibly a new wave of COVID, certainly a spike in COVID cases, hospitalizations, even deaths, almost entirely amongst the unvaccinated, especially the deaths are like 99.5% unvaccinated. And I'm going to show you, that was the main topic covered in all 4 of the news summaries, no Meet the Press this week. So I'm going to show you from longest to shortest. First, actually, CBS News, Face the Nation, and Fox News Sunday both had 2-minute 44 seconds. But I thought the Face the Nation one was definitely better. Mark Strassman, who was based in Atlanta, for some reason was in Texas, Van Horn, Texas this week, with a brief introduction from John Dickerson. And the first of the news summaries I will discuss with you after we watch it together over here.
Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. Many weeks when we put together this broadcast, we're challenged by the number of stories that we want to cover and how best to illuminate them. This is one of those weeks. We're going to try to get to a lot today. Our lead is clear, though. It's a story that has dominated the news for 18 months now, with a dangerous new twist, causing a surge of the coronavirus here in the U.S. Mark Strassman reports from Van Horn, Texas.
COVID has boomeranged. The menace, the masking, the fear, all back. And it's largely a self-inflicted wound across our 2 Americas.
This is becoming a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
As of midnight, Los Angeles reimposed its indoor mask mandate. Las Vegas wants safer odds, now recommending masks in casinos and all indoor spaces. For the first time since January, new weekly COVID cases have jumped in all 50 states, fueled by the Delta variant. Nationally, a spike of almost 70%. Hospitalizations up roughly 36%. Deaths 26%. But in the same week, nationally, new vaccination doses plummeted another 35%. Immunologists say these dots are easy to connect. Take Texas, in the bottom 20 states for its vaccination rate. Week to week, new cases here soared more than 100%. Or consider the sickest COVID patients, the ones in hospitals. Nationwide, 97% of them are unvaccinated.
Let's get rid of the vaccine!
Especially galling to scientists, the relentless campaign of distrust and disinformation against the vaccines. COVID patients are getting younger, more children in the ICU. Florida's rate of new COVID cases 4 times the national average. Governor Ron DeSantis encourages vaccinations, but hawks merchandise online that's anti-Fauci and anti-masking, messaging that resonates with millions of Americans.
I'm just done. I'm vaccinated. I don't need to wear a mask.
Infection surges in places like Tennessee, in the bottom 5 for vaccinating adults. 80% of children here between 12 and 15 are also unvaccinated. But the state has stopped all vaccine outreach to adolescents.
We've got to get folks back into their pediatrician, back into their doctor, and really ensure that they have adequate access to vaccinations and adequate education.
That's Mark Strassman in Van Horn, Texas. We go now to Ken McClure, the mayor of Springfield, Missouri, where cases have skyrocketed.
I couldn't help myself when I heard Ken McClure from Springfield. I couldn't think of Doug McClure. You may know me from such movies as, but that was an old Simpsons thing. And the interesting thing about what's happening in Missouri is, I talked about this a few weeks ago when I covered the COVID resurgence. I lived in Missouri for several years. I finished law school there. I was a public defender there. And the COVID resurgence has everything to do with the difference between Missouri and Missouri. And Springfield is definitely more Missouri. Missouri is basically 2 cities on the east coast of Missouri is St. Louis, on the west coast is Kansas City, and pretty much everything in between is all rural. So it's like the 2 cities are Missouri and the rural areas are Missouri, and Missouri is the place where they're having the COVID resurgence, including Ken McClure from Springfield. But that was more of a news summary. I think Fox News Sunday had the worst of the news summaries. I think there's the most Biden blame there, but at least they aren't like vaccine deniers like the Fox News hosts, Tucker Carlson, etc., who are the opinion people on Fox, or Brian Kilmeade on Fox and Friends. At least on Fox News Sunday, you get some semblance of facts, but I'll talk about the Fox News Sunday news summary, and you can, like I said, juxtapose it with the exact same time frames with CBS News Face the Nation. This is Chris Wallace and then Mark Meredith talking about the same facts in a slightly more skewed to the right way over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. It was just 2 weeks ago, on July 4th, that President Biden was celebrating the progress we've made in the battle against COVID. But this Sunday, that battle looks a lot tougher. Americans are once again facing the prospect of renewed mask mandates. The head of the CDC calls the spread of the Delta variant a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Dr. Rochelle Walensky citing a 70% rise in cases from the previous 7-day average, a 36% increase in hospitalizations, and a 26% increase in deaths. Meanwhile, President Biden blames misinformation on social media for some Americans' refusal to get vaccinated. In a moment, we'll discuss all this with the U.S. Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy. But first, Mark Meredith has the latest on new outbreaks, new restrictions, and new controversy about the pandemic.
That's it. 160 million people in the U.S. are now fully vaccinated, but health officials warn the COVID war is far from over.
I never imagined that we would exceed January's numbers.
The Delta variant spreading quickly across Missouri and around the country. The CDC says cases have risen every day in every state over the last 2 weeks. At least 16,000 people are currently hospitalized, and the government says most people who are sick didn't have to be.
We are seeing outbreaks of cases in parts of the country that have low vaccination coverage.
Overnight, Los Angeles County reimposed its mask mandate. The county is once again requiring people wear face coverings indoors, whether they're vaccinated or not.
Just kind of think it's disappointing for the people who have gotten vaccinated.
I think they're necessary, but it kind of ruins the fun a little bit.
The White House says vaccine hesitancy is prolonging the pandemic. President Biden is now taking aim at social media companies, claiming they're not doing enough to stop misinformation from spreading.
What's your message to platforms like Facebook?
Facebook fired right back, writing in a statement Friday, "We will not be distracted by accusations which aren't supported by the facts." The White House is now under fire from conservatives and free speech advocates after it said it's working with social media companies to flag questionable content. But the White House insists the government itself is not pulling down any content. Chris?
Mark Meredith reporting from Washington. Mark, thank you. And joining us now is the U.S. Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy.
Oh, and I don't have any clips of Vivek Murthy because, of course, like I said, I'm doing the main topic of continuing fight for voting rights, not COVID resurgence among unvaccinated. But I also, one extra point I wanted to make about the Fox News bias in that clip is they also really perseverated on the First Amendment problem with stopping COVID-19 vaccine misinformation on Facebook, etc. And that has been something they've really been playing up on Fox News, and that could be a topic in and of itself. You saw it's covered on all of the news programs on Sunday, but Fox News really gave extra emphasis. You saw they even gave Facebook fighting back against the charge that they're responsible for deaths from misinformation. And anyway, you saw the Face of the Nation and Fox News Sunday. Now here's ABC News This Week with George Stephanopoulos, hosted this week by co-host Martha Raddatz, along with Kaley Hartung, I believe, is the reporter from California, where I am, talking about how LA County has reinstituted mask mandates, as well as many other counties. You'll see a map here that includes a picture of where I am, Sacramento County, and I will talk about that news summary with you after we watch. You know what? I said that the Face of the Nation news summary and the Fox News Sunday news summary were both 2:44, but the Face of the Nation one was 10 seconds longer. Fox News Sunday and ABC are both 2:44. I know the length of the clips really fascinate all of you, but anyway, I'll talk about the ABC news summary from yesterday morning after we watched together over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. As we come on the air this morning, residents of the nation's most populous county are waking up to a new but all too familiar reality: an indoor mask mandate. Despite all the progress we've made, it's a reminder that our national fight against COVID is far from over. As the highly contagious Delta variant sweeps the country, cases are rising in nearly all 50 states. The country's daily case average has now surged by more than 60% in the last week to more than 27,000 cases. That's a whopping 143% increase over the past 4 weeks. Fueling the surge, unvaccinated Americans, who make up more than 97% of hospitalized COVID patients. The administration now targeting misinformation in their fight to overcome vaccine hesitancy. But can they actually change any minds? And could we see more major cities across America reinstitute their mask recommendations? Dr. Vivek Murthy is standing by with more. But we begin with Kaley Hartung in LA County inside the Providence St. Joseph Medical Center. Good morning to you, Kaley.
Hey, good morning, Martha. Just a few weeks ago, this hospital system in Southern California was treating just 30 COVID patients. That number has jumped to 130, and almost all of them are unvaccinated. This is an all-hands-on-deck moment, as one local official said, as the situation continues to get worse in California. For the past week in Los Angeles County, more than 1,000 new cases were reported every day, and that number was closer to 2,000 on Friday and Saturday. For perspective, a month ago, the county was averaging 200 new cases every day. We've been on something of a roller coaster here. With the numbers in check a month ago, LA County lifted virtually all restrictions, did away with capacity limits and social distancing. Bars and restaurants, they have been packed with maskless people. But now, a sharp reversal, bringing back the mask mandate for inside public places regardless of your vaccination status. And 10 counties in California are also following suit with their own guidance. Each infection prevented, experts say, is one less chance for the virus to mutate in potentially dangerous ways, as happened with the Delta variant. That highly transmissible variant is really driving the surge now. It's responsible for about 70% of COVID cases in Los Angeles County. But the sheriff here is saying he won't enforce this mask mandate. Martha, it's essentially an honor system.
Thank you so much, Kaley. Let's take all this to Hilda Solis, chair of Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors.
And as usual, the source of all my clips is down in the video description at links I put down there, including ABC News' This Week with George Stephanopoulos, so you can see the interview with Hilda Solis, even though I didn't take a clip of that. I didn't take any of the subsequent newsmaker clips on the topic of COVID-19 resurgence. But it is a big problem, especially in the more rural areas, like I was talking about from the CBS News Face the Nation news summary, where they were talking with Ken McClure of Springfield, Missouri, who I said reminded me of Doug McClure from The Simpsons, and Karen A. I noticed was the one person who pointed out in the live comments who Doug McClure was played by the late, great Phil Hartman, taken from us too soon. He was and of course, he also was the great lawyer. Was it Lionel Hutz? Lionel Hutz, was that the name of the lawyer he played? But yeah, he was a great comic actor, taken from us too soon. And so thank you, Karen A., for reminding me of that I didn't mention Phil Hartman was Doug McClure on The Simpsons. So thanks for that. And I have one more news summary from you, for you. Excuse me there. This is from CNN State of the Union, also on the topic of COVID resurgence and the pandemic of the unvaccinated. And I will talk about that news summary with you after we watch it together over here.
Hello, I'm Dana Bash in Washington, where the state of our union is seeing red. Coronavirus cases are surging across the country once again as the highly contagious Delta variant spreads. All 50 states and Washington, D.C. are now seeing rising cases. That's the first time that has happened since January. As many of us know by now, the COVID vaccines are extraordinarily effective at preventing serious disease, and 99% of those who are now dying of COVID are unvaccinated. This new wave did not have to happen. The United States is a country where the vaccine is readily available and free, yet less than half of the U.S. population is fully vaccinated against COVID. And as vaccine hesitancy turns into vaccine hostility and health officials brace for more avoidable pain and death, some local leaders are encouraging, or in the case of LA County, mandating the use of masks indoors, regardless of people's vaccination status. While the Biden administration tries to tackle false information about the vaccines, President Biden is saying flat out, he said it on Friday, that social media platforms are killing people by allowing vaccine lies to spread. As the U.S. Surgeon General took an extraordinary step of labeling vaccine misinformation a serious threat to public health. And joining me now is the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
And there you see the CNN State of the Union news summary, like all the other ones, really emphasized how misinformation was killing people, rather than the Fox News Sunday news summary, which went the extra step to say, no, it's suppressing misinformation is a threat to the First Amendment, and Facebook's fighting back, and all those extra things. And speaking of misinformation, I saw several people in the live comments pointing out that when I said Doug McClure, I should have said Troy McClure. I apologize to the family of Phil Hartman for making that mistake. I think in the live comments there, it was Colin Baker who pointed out that Doug McClure was a real actor, probably best known for The Virginian. So at least there's some reason for my brain making that mistake, but I apologize for that. And not that it really matters in terms of the news, but we don't want to spread misinformation, especially about Phil Hartman and Troy McClure. But was Lionel Hutz the lawyer? Was that the name of the lawyer that Phil Hartman played? I still didn't see that down in the comment section. So you can let me know about that as we move on to the main title topic, the existential threat to U.S. democracy from these voter suppression laws. I have 4 clips on that. The best news summary on this was from, news summary and then newsmaker interviews all wrapped it into one was from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, where Martha Raddatz went to Pennsylvania and talked to this right-wing Republican about their voter suppression laws. And also you'll see there's a clip from an ACLU, from the ACLU political director, Ronald Newman, who I actually met a few years ago at an ACLU biennial conference in Denver. And I even put a screenshot of Ronald Newman in the thumbnail for the video, if you're wondering who that guy is on the left next to Amy Klobuchar. It's Ronald Newman. And like I said, I think this is the best overview of the various sides on voting rights versus voter suppression. And this is, like I said, both, it's a combination news summary and newsmaker interview compilation from ABC that I think is the best, that I'm going to juxtapose with what they did on Fox News Sunday on the topic, because you'll see they did this news summary and newsmaker interview compilation before they went to their panel. On Fox News Sunday, all they did was the panel that gave very little, much more heat than light. But I'll get to the Fox News Sunday clip after we watch the ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos clip with Martha Raddatz going to Pennsylvania and talking to Republican state senator there and ACLU political director Ronald Newman. Quiet down, Sandy. Did you hear Sandy whining there? I don't know. Maybe it was because I was talking about the Republican state senator in Pennsylvania. I don't know. But I'll try to find out, and I'll tell you what I find out after we watch the ABC clip together over here.
Assault on free and fair elections is just such a threat, literally. I've said it before. We're facing the most significant test of our democracy since the Civil War.
That mainstream state laws are more dangerous than 2 world wars? More dangerous than poll test and Bull Connor and actual Jim Crow segregation? And somehow analogous to the Civil War? What utter nonsense.
President Biden and Mitch McConnell on the latest political flashpoint, voting rights, as Republican state lawmakers across the country push new restrictions in the name of election integrity, critics calling it voter suppression. This week, Texas House Democrats fled the state in a last-ditch effort to block a voting restrictions bill. I sat down with one of those lawmakers and traveled to battleground Pennsylvania to look at the debate shaping the future of America's elections. From Texas to Georgia, Arizona to Alabama, the fight over voting rights is intensifying. We shall not be moved. All across the nation, Republican state lawmakers proposing or passing legislation that critics say makes it more difficult for Americans to vote, including requiring uniform IDs, restricting ballot drop boxes, and even trying to prohibit people from passing out water to those waiting in line to vote. Here in Pennsylvania, a battleground state in 2020, the issue of election reform is white hot after widespread claims of election fraud. Claims that are unfounded, with no evidence the election outcome would change. But Republican State Senator David Argall is charging ahead anyway, with hopes of more restrictions. If you have a more restrictive time when you can vote, or making it harder to send in a mail-in ballot, if you have a job that you can't leave in the middle of the day, that you can't vote until late at night, that you need to apply to vote way earlier than some people. What's the matter with that?
I think our goal, and you've heard it in other states as well, is to make it easier to vote, but harder to cheat. And so I really, really push back hard with those folks that think that, this is some kind of a threat to democracy. I think it's never been easier to vote in Pennsylvania than it is today. We just want to make sure it's done right.
Kendra Cochran, an activist fighting for voting rights, says the move to restrict voters is an obvious effort to target minority communities who help put Democrats over the top in this state.
I feel like this is a retaliation for us showing up last year. They want to discourage the folks. They want to make sure that we don't have the same result that we did. A lot of these bills are rooted in racism, if we just want to call it out.
In Texas, Republicans proposed a ban on 24-hour voting, drive-through voting, and mailing absentee ballot applications to all eligible voters. Measures, they argue, were only enacted as emergency procedures during the COVID pandemic. To block it, Texas Democrats, including Trey Martinez Fisher, walked out of the state legislature and headed to D.C. to break quorum.
This is a suppression session to suppress the voices of voters, and we knew that if we weren't bold and defiant, and if we didn't have the courage to walk away and use the rules that are in our Texas Constitution, they would run us over.
Which they will likely still do as they come up with new bills and new restrictions. And not just in Texas, the ACLU tracking more restrictions every day.
This isn't a partisan issue. So we want voting to be more convenient. We want voting to be easier. We want as many eligible Americans as possible to be able to vote. So I don't think I understand what problem we're trying to solve. There's the theoretical concern about voter fraud, but there's scant evidence that that has actually been an issue.
But with fears growing with Democrats that local efforts will fail to stop restrictions, many are turning to federal voting rights legislation that is on an even shakier footing. So let's discuss that and much more with our roundtable. AP Washington Bureau Chief Julie Pace.
So you can see there, ABC had that really informative new extra news summary. In addition to their news summary about the COVID resurgence, they had a news summary just about the fight for voting rights, including some right-wing Republican state senator from Pennsylvania. What was his name? David Argall, or I have it. There's down in the video description. I've actually described every single one of the clips. His name is David Argall. And then I also had a clip there from Ronald Newman, who I met, like I said, at ACLU Biennial in Denver several years ago. So that was the best of the summaries of the kind of voting rights restrictions that are happening in, I think, 17 states have already passed them. Texas, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona. There's all sorts of stuff going on. Oh, and during the live comments, I read the live comments during that last clip, and I saw that Colin Baker thanked me for talking about Doug McClure from the Virginian and Troy McClure being the actual fake actor that Phil Hartman played in The Simpsons. And if you want some more comedy, read about Freedom Day here in the UK, or as some call it, Freedom Day. Well, I'll have to read about that after the live stream, but thanks for that, Colin. I really appreciate those of you who support my live stream with Super Chat contributions during the show. You can also become a YouTube member by pressing that join button underneath the video. The best supporters are my monthly patrons on Patreon. There's a link down in the video description to become a Patreon patron, and there's also a link down there for a one-time PayPal contribution if you want to support my videos that way, since I don't make a lot of ad revenue from YouTube these days, but I do want to juxtapose that great ABC news summary about what's going on with voter suppression you noticed how they gave that great news summary and then started their panel discussion, which I didn't take a clip from. Well, on Fox News Sunday, there was no great news summary. You had to get all your information from the panel discussion that included Karl Rove of course, and Harold Ford, who's this right-wing Democrat from Tennessee, who hasn't been in office for a while, and then Susan Page, but not a lot of good information like you saw from ABC. It's mostly misinformation, which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that. This is all the coverage voter suppression got on Fox News Sunday. Just this panel discussion with, like I said before I showed the ABC clip, a lot more heat than light, which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
About the trip to Philadelphia, Harold, brings me up to another big domestic story this week, and that is the continuing and maybe an escalating battle over voting rights. Here was President Biden this week.
This is election subversion. It's the most dangerous threat to voting and the integrity of free and fair elections in our history.
But Harold, at the same time that President Biden is saying this is the most direct threat to voting in the history of the country, he's absolutely silent about changing the filibuster, which is the reason that, because of Republican ability to continue the filibuster, that they're able to block any federal voting reforms. How do you square stating how serious, how almost existential the threat is, and then being unwilling to discuss or take any intermediate action?
Well, first off, happy Sunday morning. I think the two are compatible still, Chris. I think the president, is trying to convey to Republicans and Democrats alike that with the most successful election, and I define success in an election not by whether your candidate wins, that's what you'd like to see happen in terms of an outcome, but when you have as many people vote as we did in 2020 with as few challenges and problems, and we saw the court challenges, all of them dismissed, you have to think that makes our democracy stronger. Now, for those who are changing some of these rules or laws or amending their state laws, you have to wonder what the intentions are. I'm reminded of what Dr. King said some 6 decades ago when asked about voting rights and African Americans, but really could have been talking about any Americans. He said some people don't want some people to vote. When you have record turnout, with record low levels of challenges, why would you want to change that? I understand we all want our candidate to win, but candidates for office don't get to pick their voters. Voters get to pick their candidates. So I hope all of these states would think about that as they think about changes. And if President Biden can't persuade enough Republicans to come along with him in the Senate, maybe he will consider the filibuster change. I'm not in favor of that, but it looks as if the threat that the president believes as grave as he thinks it is, he may be prepared to travel down that path.
Carl, ground zero right now in the fight over voting restrictions is your home state of Texas. And of course, the big story there is the fact that dozens of state representatives have fled Texas, have gone to D.C., and are basically saying they're going to stay there throughout this special session into next month to block the Texas legislature from having a quorum so they can pass these new voting restrictions. My question is, on the ground there in Texas, how is this playing? Is it changing any minds, turning people either on or off the Democratic argument, or is it just mobilizing both sides and making them angrier?
Well, I think right now it's both sides are gaining something out of this, but I think ultimately this thing works against the Democrats. You said new voting restrictions. Let me set the record straight. This law does not put in force new voting restrictions. It amplifies previous law that was violated by one county in our state, Harris County, home of Houston, which decided in violation of state law it would have 24-hour voting, and it would have drive-through voting for anybody. In Texas, you can only get drive-through voting if you're unable to go into the precinct. That's what HB 3, this bill, does. So if President Biden, who declared that this is 21st century Jim Crow, if he believes that, then he ought to denounce Delaware, which does not allow 24-hour voting and which also does not allow for drive-through voting either. So neither does New York, neither does Massachusetts, neither does Minnesota. I mention those states because Senators Gillibrand, Warren, and Klobuchar have all jumped into this fight attacking Texas as racist. And the two things that this law principally does, their state doesn't allow.
In about 30 seconds, Susan, where do we stand here? Because red states are going to continue, you can call it new voting restrictions or reimposing what the old rules were pre-pandemic. The president can't get a federal law through because of the Republican filibuster in the Senate. The Supreme Court is upholding the law changes, the voting changes in states like Arizona. So what is Biden and the Democrats, what do they do?
So here's the disconnect. You can describe it as the biggest threat to voting, to democracy since the Civil War, but Democrats are not in a position to actually do anything about it on the federal level or in more than a dozen states that continue to tighten voting laws and change the oversight of elections. So what you've got an issue, not a solution. It's something Democrats will be talking about to the next election.
And of course, all of these rules could change who actually votes in the 2022 midterms. Panel, thank you. We have to take a break here. We'll see you later.
So you can see there that no one really talks about all the specific voter suppression laws that you saw in the ABC this week with George Stephanopoulos news summary. They just, you saw Karl Rove poo-poo the even idea that these were voter suppression laws or voter restrictions, because Republicans are all about expanding the electorate. And I mean, it's really, really sad, unfortunately, that the Republicans have decided that instead of trying to win the most votes, they're going to try to warp the American form of government in the greatest way possible to preserve the voting power of the dwindling white majority. I guess I saw a recent story that in 2044, that's when white people are no longer going to be the majority in the United States, but the Republican Party, as the party of white people in the United States, apparently is trying to use the undemocratic parts of the U.S. governmental structure to preserve the power of white people. That is basically what I am concluding from what I'm seeing from the Republican Party and what you just saw from those arguments on Fox News. And it's not just the voter suppression laws that make it harder to vote that you saw ABC talking about, but there's actually a two-prong effort. And that's why I wanted to show you this next clip from CBS News Face the Nation, where John Dickerson did a brief introduction and then talked to David Becker. David Becker is the executive director and founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research. And this is kind of like a bookend to the ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary that was so much better than the Fox News Sunday panel discussion. Well, the ABC News summary told you about the specifics of various laws that are suppressing the vote. This is more of a 30,000-foot view of what's happening, and you'll see David Becker here saying not only are there these provisions that make it harder for people to vote, but this is something I talked about several weeks ago. There are these provisions that let Republican legislatures usurp the popular vote, like decide the popular vote doesn't matter. They're going to insert their own opinion instead. So that's the two-pronged problem. And then there's also this national security problem that is allowing American elections to be susceptible to outside foreign influence. All of that is in this CBS News Face the Nation clip that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that clip on the topic of existential threat to U.S. democracy, the fight for voting rights. Over here.
Since the November election, 17 states have enacted new laws that tighten rules around casting ballots and running elections. In an effort to keep Texas from becoming the 18th, Democrats in the state legislature staged a dramatic protest, flying to Washington to block Republicans from passing a more restrictive voting law. To help us put those challenges into perspective, we're joined by David Becker, the director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. Welcome. Nice to have you here, David.
Thanks. Great to be here, John.
There's a lot going on. So just give us the basic perspective of what's going on with all of these different voting rights efforts.
So we're seeing a lot of highly partisan efforts to make it harder for some people to vote. They do appear to be targeted in some ways to ensure that, in particular, the Republican Party right now might be perceived to have a better chance of winning some elections. But what I'm also very concerned about are unprecedented efforts to inject toxic partisanship into the counting of ballots and the certification of election results that occur during election and after an election, where you're going to see potentially chaos from things like what we're seeing in Texas, where they're introducing efforts to allow for partisan poll watchers to roam free within the polling place, interfering with the process, where we're seeing efforts to criminalize activities by professional election administrators who are trying to make it easier and more efficient and more secure for elections to be run. We've never really seen that before, and it could be potentially a national security issue.
So I'll get to the national security issue in a second, but essentially, do we have two baskets of concern here? One is limits and challenges to just getting to the polling place and the right to vote. And then the second is what you do after those votes are cast and who gets to oversee them and who gets to question them and that kind of thing. Is those the two basic categories?
I think that's basically right. And it's important to note that these are all being based on a complete lie, that the election somehow had some irregularities. We're now well over 8 months past the election. The losing candidate hasn't brought forth any evidence that's been considered by any court or anywhere else that's been valid that the election was not secure. And in fact, this election was, as Attorney General Barr said, as the DHS said under Trump, as the FBI said, and as many others said, this was the most secure and transparent and verified election we've ever held in American history.
Yeah, actually, just reset the table here. How many actual people, humans, have been charged or anything with fraud in 2020 in the whole country?
I mean, very few. It's a handful. I believe it's under 10 at this point in time. The total number of potential fraud cases that we might see in an election of this size, 160 million people voted in November, which is amazing. But the total number of fraud cases we might see is going to be measured in the dozens out of 160 million, not anywhere near anything that could have affected the outcome.
So back to the two categories you were talking about, the problems with voting and then the problems after the vote is cast. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell said these are common sense measures out in the country. They're just trying to unwind the measures that were brought in under the age of COVID and sort of restore things to the way it was before. Is that an accurate characterization of the scope of things that are being suggested?
I don't think it's entirely accurate. I think what we're seeing it's always a good idea after an election to look at what actually worked based on facts and maybe consider ways to improve that. And there are ways to increase integrity while also increasing access. What we're seeing here are things like in Georgia, for instance, where they ran not only the most successful, highest turnout election they've ever held, they actually ran 2 of them within a 2-month period of time. But they did this with paper ballots for the first time in 2 decades, and they were able to count every one of those presidential ballots 3 times, 3 different ways, once entirely by hand. We should be applauding those efforts. I think another thing that's really important here is when we talk about election integrity, it is actually good for election integrity when we have more people voting in different ways over a period of time. We don't want to have a single point of failure on election day, where if something goes wrong, we can't fix it. If we learn of a problem at 1 p.m. on election day, it's very hard to fix by the time the polls close. But if we have people voting by mail, people voting early in person, and people voting on election day, as we saw in most states in 2020, we can actually find problems early and fix them so they don't affect the outcome of the election. That's a very good integrity measure.
So if those ways of voting are limited, then does that mean there's the opportunity for more chaos? Is this what you were talking about in terms of national security? There's more opportunity for chaos, and America's enemies love opportunities for chaos.
That's right. Imagine now we're in a highly partisan environment. We're concentrating more voting on election day in polling places where there might be long lines, where partisan poll watchers have free rein to engage in chaos. And then we are now injecting partisanship into the counting and certification process, where partisans might be tempted to overturn the will of the people, and they are somewhat empowered to do that by their legislators. This could be a void that our adversaries see and try to exploit in some ways.
So, like I said, I think that was a good bookend for the Fox News misinformation. ABC, before Fox News, showed you a lot of specifics about how there are laws that are suppressing the vote, and then David Becker there gave you a more general overview of the two prongs of the attack on our election integrity from Republicans, both in terms of suppressing the vote and also allowing manipulation by Republican legislatures after the vote has taken place, and even the national security issue there you saw him talk about. And then in terms of the political process for fixing this problem, the final news clip I want to show you is from Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. Was over on CNN's State of the Union with Dana Bash yesterday, and she was talking about both these field hearings that she's holding, I believe right now while I'm doing the live stream in Atlanta. Senate committees usually hold their hearings in Washington, D.C., but every now and then they go and do these field hearings off somewhere in the rest of the United States. Well, this week or today, Amy Klobuchar is holding hearings in Atlanta, Georgia about the Georgia elections. She talks about meeting with Ralph Warnock, who's up for re-election in 2022, and also about the political process by which some of these voting rights reforms might be passed through the reconciliation process, which only requires 50 Democratic votes, through voting infrastructure, but also some of the other ways that these reforms might be passed in the final news clip I'm going to show you before I finish the show with my two bonus Dash and Sandy clips, or Dandy clips, to finish the show. But here's Dana Bash talking to Amy Klobuchar, senator from Minnesota, who is out in Atlanta as I'm broadcasting, as I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Welcome back to State of the Union. A Senate committee will hold its first hearing away from Washington in 2 decades tomorrow to hear from Georgia voters about the state's new election law, which many Democrats say will suppress minority voters in that state, the one that President Biden flipped in 2020. The chair of the Rules Committee, Senator Amy Klobuchar, joins us live from Atlanta, where she will be holding a voting rights town hall today with Stacey Abrams. Senator, thank you so much for joining me. So you well know you still need 60 votes in the Senate to get anything done.
That's right.
On anything, and that includes voting rights when it comes to legislation, I should say. Some Senate Democrats are still not willing to sidestep the filibuster on this issue. Is your hearing in Georgia going to change that?
We've seen a concerted effort across the country. You know this, Dana. Over 400 bills introduced, 28 signed into law, including this really bad one in Georgia that not only denies voters water when they're standing in line, but also reduces the runoff time to 28 days. And guess what? You have to register 29 days before. This is clearly a focus by the Republicans in Georgia on limiting people from voting. So we're doing this hearing, yes, to build pressure to pass basic federal voting rights, and that is the For the People Act, the John Lewis bill, you name it. And so if we were just to concede and say, okay, we had one vote, the Republicans blocked it, so we're taking our marbles and going home. Well, that's sure not fair to the people of Georgia. That's sure not fair to the people of Texas. So we're not giving up. And you know there are many ways to proceed here, including the upcoming infrastructure packages that was just discussed with Senator Portman. I'm happy to answer. I think we need a deadline that Senator Schumer set. I think we need to get going. But election infrastructure could actually be in the Democratic package, and that's part of the solution. The House is starting their hearings this fall on the John Lewis Act, and we are moving on that bill. Then we have a very aggressive Justice Department. This is no longer Bill Barr's Justice Department. This is one that contains people like Vanita Gupta and Kristen Clark,
Senator,
that is ready to go and enforce these laws.
Senator, I just want to follow up on something you just said, because one way to pass the legislation you're talking about, voting rights legislation with only 51 votes, is through a process known as reconciliation. And House Democratic Whip Jim Clyburn has been floating the idea of trying to pass voting rights that way. Are you saying that you think Senate rules would allow you to pass at least some of the voting rights proposals and provisions through reconciliation?
That process, to be clear, is no substitute for the For the People Act. It isn't, because the For the People Act is grounded in the Constitution that says Congress can set and alter federal rules for elections.
But if you can't get that done?
But if you can't, okay, just to go, what you can do with infrastructure, which is not in the bipartisan package, and I'm glad they're continuing to negotiate and make progress. What you can do is put election infrastructure in there. You could tie it to certain things as incentives for states to do same-day registration, to do the mail-in balloting. But it is no substitute for putting the basic federal rights in place. What I'm saying is you've got to do all these things at once.
Okay. And I want to ask about President Biden, because he gave a big speech pledging to do everything possible to push back on efforts to restrict voting rights. But, you know, he still hasn't supported calls from Democrats, including yourself, to bypass the filibuster in order to pass the broad legislation that you're talking about. So are you urging the president to change his stance?
The president is going to make his own decisions, and he's done an incredible job pushing out the vaccines and building the support for these very important infrastructure packages to help people with childcare and housing in the Democratic package. But what I think we should do, myself, having been here the last decade and seen exactly what's going on, we need to abolish the filibuster. If you want to move on immigration reform, if you want to move on climate change, as the fires are going in the West, and as we've seen record heat, 120 degrees up in Canada, I think we know what we need to do. That being said, I am here today on voting rights, and Senator Manchin has worked with me over the last few months on what is a very good package in terms of some basic federal voting rights, commended by Stacey Abrams, commended by Barack Obama. And that's the first step. The second step will be to find a way to get this through. Number one would be to get Republicans. I personally don't think that's going to happen. So the second thing is to say, well, Senator Manchin has indicated some interest in the standing filibuster. That is one way to do it. We could have it focused on voting rights only. So we're continuing to work with him and many others to get this done. But so I'm here in Georgia to tell people we're not giving up just because of some archaic rule in the Senate that basically was set up for not good purposes and is once again blocking legislation that would help the people of this country.
So since you're saying you don't think Republicans are going to come on board, in your conversations with Senator Manchin, you do think it is possible to convince him that on just this issue of voting rights to sidestep the filibuster?
You know, it's not just my conversations. It's people like Senator Warnock, Reverend Warnock, who I'm about to see at his church. It is people like John Tester in Montana, who are in a very red purple states and who understand what's going on,
but
where
all
they're
of those
basically messing
are
around.
An impact on him?
I think Joe Manchin listens, and I'm not giving up. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
I am not giving up.
New topic, Senator. I want you to hear.
So there you see Senator Amy Klobuchar, who's holding field hearings right now in Atlanta, Georgia, on fighting for voting rights, giving you the whole range of political solutions to Republicans trying to entrench minority white power in by through their gerrymandering in the state legislatures, and of course the U.S. Senate gives way too much power to empty land that I've talked about this many times, how Wyoming has like 500,000 or 600,000 people, gets 2 senators, while California has like 35 to 40 million people, gets 2 senators. That's not one person, one vote. That is not a democratic part of the U.S. Constitution. But the filibuster makes it even worse, where you have to get 60% of the votes of people who represent land and not people. And Anyway, Amy Klobuchar talked about how maybe Joe Manchin would be, one of the most conservative of the Democratic senators, basically to do something with 50 plus 1 votes, 50 votes of Democrats plus Kamala Harris, the vice president. Democrats will have to convince conservative Democrat Joe Manchin of West Virginia, and of course Kyrsten Sinema, conservative Democrat from Arizona. But Amy Klobuchar was talking about maybe convincing them to carve out an exception to the filibuster for voting rights or constitutional rights. That's something James Clyburn, the majority whip in the House of Representatives, has advocated. I've talked about that in previous shows. And then there's the idea of just putting it into reconciliation, which is, if you do budget legislation, you only have to get 50 votes because that's one of the carve-outs to the filibuster that's already occurred in the Senate. That's one of the things about filibuster reform. The Senate has already decided that you only need 50 plus the vice president to confirm the appointments from the president to his his executive branch appointments, and then they said 50 plus 1 for judicial appointments, except for the Supreme Court. And then the Republicans, that both those previous changes were Democrats, then the Republicans expanded it to Supreme Court justices so they could get 3 justices when Trump was president. And now James Clyburn and maybe Amy Klobuchar are advocating for an additional carve-out for constitutional rights or voting rights, or so you can change, you can pass voting rights legislation with just 50 votes plus the vice president. I don't know if any of that's going to happen, but those are ways that Amy Klobuchar was talking about there, that voting rights might actually happen without any Republican votes. But I want to finish the show, as I promised, with my Dash and Sandy or Dandy clips. But before I do that, I do want to thank my Super Chat contributors, especially because I'm not sure if this live stream was completely recorded on YouTube. I might have to upload the recorded show later, like in an hour or two, for like I might have to do this all over again with more live viewers that I will watch the recorded show with you all, depending on what was recorded. There might be a gap at the beginning, but I want to give credit to the Super Chat contributors for this live stream, the 3 of you here. I already talked about the Colin Baker contribution, but thanks to Joe Burley and, of course, Lulu Girl for those additional contributions. And before I finish the show, I did promise two Dash and Sandy or Dandy clips. I talked about how my dog Sandy has been suffering from old dog vestibular disease, and we've been treating her for it. One of the side effects of this disease was for a couple days, because she was so dizzy from her ear disease, she threw up several times, and after that she wouldn't eat the regular food that she'd thrown up anymore, so we had to get her new food. And I've shown several clips of how my cat Dash really likes to eat my dog Sandy's food. Well, not the new food. That's the first Dash and Sandy clip. showing how Dash the cat does not like to eat the new kibble we got because Sandy won't eat the old kibble that she threw up because of her dizziness from old dog vestibular disease. And that's the first, here's the first Dash and Sandy clip, Sandy eating her food that Dash won't eat over here. So there you can see Sandy eating the new kibble that Dash won't eat. And yes, I saw in the live comments asking if Sandy is doing better. Yes, she is definitely doing better. We've done more research on this disease, and apparently sometimes we're still in the 2-week period where we are treating her. Apparently sometimes dogs have long-term effects from this where they still like always have their head turned to the side, or they stumble a little bit, a little bit off balance. We don't know. Those are two things that Sandy is still doing. But you saw there in that last clip how Dash the cat, he doesn't like to eat Sandy's food anymore since we switched kibble. But for those of you who are worried, where does Dash get his food? Well, I don't think I've ever recorded where Dash gets his food, but it's up on a bathroom sink where Sandy can't get to it, which you can see from this morning over here. So there you go, the Dash and Sandy, and then bonus Dash clips at the end of the show. I will check to see if YouTube recorded the entire show, if there's this gap that people were complaining about at the beginning. If there is some sort of recording error or stream error, I will upload the recorded version and have a live premiere in an hour or two, but I don't know, I'll have to wait a few minutes and see what happened. But I will be back next Monday and every Monday through the summer. Until then, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.